Hi and welcome to the sew along video for pattern 1802 Rachel's Sundress. This pattern is made to be sewn with an overlocker and a plain sewing machine. So when you're ready, thread your overlocker up with 4 threads of colour that match your fabric, and the seam allowances here are 6mm, which is 1/4 inch. So make sure the dial on the side of your machine is either set to 6 or 1/4 inch. When you thread up your sewing machine, it's a good idea to lengthen the stitch length from normal. Make sure you put a ball needle into your machine, which will make sure your fabric doesn't get ruined as it's being sewn. And when we go to sew the hems, if you have access to a cover stitcher, it's a really good idea to use that. Or if you have a twin needle on a domestic sewing machine, you could use that as well. So the video I'm going to show you is just my suggested way of sewing this garment, but of course these are only guidelines and feel free to sew this however you choose. So when you're ready, take the skirt pieces and we'll get started on the centre back seam. So here is the centre back of my skirt, and part way down the seam you'll see double notches. Now you need to make sure that those are matched together as you sew to make sure the skirt sits properly. So when you're ready, start to sew that. It's a good idea to start from the waist line. So the waist is the side that has all the notches cut along the top of it. So match the centre back there and start overlocking. Now this pattern, we're not going to cut any seam allowance off the side. So when you sew, make sure you just sew directly on the edge, and the cutting guide is just for fraying and stray threads only. There's the double notch there. We're going to make sure that both layers have the double notch in the same position. And as you approach the end, there'll be a notch here. Now that just simply shows you the turn position for the hem. And the hem on this garment is 2 centimetres, which is near enough to 3/4 inch. Right, so when you've sewn that, what we're going to do is open it up and have a look at the edge with all the notches in it. So what I'm going to do now is put all the pleats in the correct position. You can hold that in place with a pin within the seam allowance, or you could go to your plain sewing machine and tack stitch hold this into place. So these pleats all face towards the centre back, which is the seam we've just sewn. So what we do is come to the right hand side here, so that's the side with the curve. As you go along the front, you'll find a notch. What we're going to do is pick that notch up and put it directly on top of the second notch. And the pleat here, the fold, needs to face towards the centre back. So when that's in the correct position, I'm just going to hold that in place with a pin, so that fold is directly on that pleat line. Then we're going to leave a gap and find the next notch and do the same thing. And a third time. Now we've done this side, come to the other side of the waist. We're going to do what we just did but in reverse. Find the first pleat position, pick it up and put it on the second pleat, and now we want the pleat to fold towards the centre back, which is this side here. Leave a gap, find the next notch and do the same thing. And repeat. Now it's up to you whether you wanted to do this before or after you put those pleats in place, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the hem of the skirt in. So if you have a cover stitcher, go to your cover stitcher, fold at that 2 centimetre notch, which is the notch up here that shows us the hem turn position, and cover stitch that into place. If you don't have access to a cover stitcher, you could also use a twin needle. I'm going to assume you don't have access to both, so what I'm going to do is overlock the edge, which is this long curved edge of the skirt. Then I'm going to press it with my iron, and I'm going to sew it on my plain sewing machine with a plain stitch. Right, so now I'm going to move across to my iron and press that seam into position at 2 centimetres, which is 3/4 of an inch, or near enough to, and then I'm going to move to my plain sewing machine and stitch that into place. So I took a piece of spare scrap fabric to my iron and did a press test, and this fabric did not react very well to being ironed. So I'm not going to go ahead and press this now. What I'll do is I will press the hem after I've sewn it. So generally with sewing we sew a seam, press a seam. What that means is the iron sort of embeds the stitches into the fabric and it gives a really nice crisp result. So turn at the notch position there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the width guides on my needle plate to sew this, and I like to sew this from the wrong side of the fabric. So even though this is patterned at 2 centimetres, which is 3/4 of an inch, you may gain or lose a little bit of extra depending on your overlocking. So what I'm going to do is make sure that that is nice and even, and I'm going to stitch my first row of stitching directly through my overlocking. And I'm just making sure my stitch width is longer, and start sewing. So because I want this to look like I have sewn it on a cover stitcher, what I'm going to do now is turn this over to the right side, and I'm going to sew a second row of stitching parallel to this first row, and I'm going to sew it on the side closest to the fold here. So now move across to your iron and press that into the correct position. So now we're working on the bodice. Take your pair of backs and we're going to first of all sew the centre back seam in place. It's just a nice straight line, so you shouldn't have too many problems with that. Open this up and then find the front bodice piece and place them right sides together, matching the shoulders. Overlock this seam here at the shoulder. And then come straight through to the other shoulder and overlock that into place as well. Turn and overlock the side seam here. And then turn again and overlock in the other side seam. The next step is we're going to sew the armhole band into place. Now I've created a piece you can cut to size for this armhole area here. If you're going to struggle or you're struggling with the idea of sewing a band in place here, what you can do is cut an entire piece identical to this and then simply put them right sides together and stitch around these areas. So effectively you're creating a bag out piece. For those of you who aren't very good sewers and are very uncomfortable with sewing the band in, that's certainly a very acceptable and easy alternative to doing a band, but if you follow this way of doing bands you won't probably find it too difficult anyway and you'll learn a new skill. So what I'm going to do is put this aside somewhere safely and take one of the armhole pieces. So you've got two arm band pieces that are the same. The key to sewing the bands is making sure they're cut the right width all the way through. It just makes it a bit easier. So take one of the bands, fold it right sides together and just overlock that short area there. And do the same thing for the other piece. Now we want to make sure this is sewn on in exactly the right place. So fold it in half like this and directly at the fold point, take your scissors or your thread snips and just place a small notch there. Now that will show us the position of the shoulder seam. So when you've done that with one, do that with the other. And remember those notches are only tiny. 3 mils, 1/8 of an inch is fine. Right. So what we're going to do now is fold these so wrong sides are together. And the seam position here is the underarm point. and the notch we created directly opposite it is the shoulder point. Take your garment, and I always find it easier to sew it with the wrong sides out, and open up one of the underarm areas. Take that band you've just created and place it so right sides are together like that. Let's pop that up. So we want this seam to face towards the back, that's fine. Now if you want to, you can hold that in place with a pin before you go ahead and mark in the shoulder point, but I'm just going to use my overlocker without any pins on this, and I'm going to start to the side of the seam, and the reason I'm starting to the side of the seam is because that seam is quite bulky. What we want to do is just position this so that the seams of the band are directly on top of the seam at the underarm. Make sure all those raw edges match, and when you're ready, put that in your overlocker. Just sew a few stitches just to hold that into position. Okay, so now that's secured in place, fold this and find that notch that you created, and that notch needs to match to the shoulder seam. We want the shoulder seam to face towards the back as well. Take your time doing this, it's worth it to get the ease in the correct position. So if you're uncomfortable with doing this, pop a pin in there just to hold it into place, and now we're going to overlock this on. If you have those two positions in the correct place, sewing this won't be difficult, well, shouldn't be too difficult. Now if you're like me and you have a removable cuff here, you might find it easier to use that. I'm just going to show you how we do it without. So what I'm going to do is just stretch this and sew it, making sure all those edges are perfectly lined up, and I need to make sure that the width is exactly the same all the way around. So I'm just going to sew a small amount at a time, taking care to make sure everything is matched on the raw edge. One thing you don't want to have to do with bands is end up going over it again, because you end up with a bulky piece of overlocking. And when we sew it, when we stretch it, we don't want to stretch it too much. So this band has 85% stretch deducted, just to allow it to fit nicely. So when you come up towards that shoulder position, take the pin out if you've used it, and just reposition that in the correct place. Okay, so go ahead now and repeat that for the other armhole. So here we have the armband sewn into place. Now if you want to, you could sew a line of stitching, making sure the seam is pressed towards the inside of the garment. You could sew a line of edge stitching in here if you want to. I don't find there's going to be any need for it, but that is an option. Alright, so now we're going to work on the neck area. So our neckband piece looks like this. So what we've got here is this angled piece here is the center front of the neck, and then as you come down the piece we have a notch which is the shoulder position, another notch for the center back, and another notch for the other shoulder. So what we're going to do is fold this in half, and we need to overlock this angle together. So all we need to do when we overlock is just open it like this so we sew a straight line. It's really important that you get this matched up properly. So start by putting it in your overlocker and sewing a few stitches. Once you've sewn a few stitches, we don't want to cut the middle of it here, so just open it up as much as you can and sew a straight line, match the other side all the way to the edge. So this is what creates that V-neck. Right, so when you've done that, open this up and you will see that that is the center front of our V-neck position, like that. So fold this so that the wrong sides are together, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin this in place. You could use your plain sewing machine to tack stitch this into place, whatever you find easier. So match that and find the center back, which is the middle of the 3 notches. So this notch here is the center back. And place that center back, making sure that it matches the center back seam here. So I'm going to pin this in place. Then I'm going to go across and find my next notch here, which is the shoulder seam, and that will need to be stretched across there. We're going to make sure that that seam presses towards the center back. And then I'm going to come across to the other shoulder. Match the 2 notches here and the raw edges. To the shoulder position. Making sure that seam faces towards the back, and I'm going to hold that in place as well. And of course the next position we have to match is this V-neck here towards the center front. So what I'm going to do is match those raw edges, and just for now I'm going to come down and match that position there. Now it's really hard to get a V-neck sitting perfectly with the overlocker, and if you can't get it sitting perfectly with the overlocker, just go to your plain sewing machine and redo that line in with the line of plain stitches just on the inside of that overlocking line. I'm just going to pin that in place there. So I know what I'm working with. Okay. So now, because I don't want my overlocking to start and finish at the centre back, or you can if you want, if you have a label going in to hide that, that's fine. I'm going to start just in here, which is just short of a shoulder line, so that means my overlocking will start and finish in a place that it's a little more hidden. The other thing I want to do is when I overlock this, I want to overlock this from the front of my garment. I just find it easier to put the V-neck in that way, but if you find it easier to overlock from the inside of your garment, certainly do that. Okay. So come to the position you want to start, and I'm just going to remove the pin, and make sure you do take the pins out. If you leave them in, you will smash your needle. So because of the ease, you will need to stretch this neckband into place. The main thing is to make sure it's not twisted. So we want to make sure that that ease is evenly distributed as we overlock. So make sure all of those edges line up. And we don't want to stretch too much as we sew either. So So try and sew in as much of a continuous line as you can. Now stop before you get to the V position. So just like we sewed that V together, what we want to do here is we want to try and straighten out this V as much as possible. Some people find it easier to put a tiny nick at the center of the V so they know exactly where the V-neck position is. What we've got to do is imagine a line 6 mils in, which is 1/4 of an inch, and 6 mils in that. So that's about there. Now that line should run from directly through the center front, so on the straight grain line. So if you imagine that position there, when we sew, that position there needs to sit up exactly 6 mils, 1/4 of an inch, on that seam we created there. So that needs to sit there like that. So that's why V-necks can be a little bit tricky, because we have to make sure that everything is sitting exactly in the correct place. So what I'm going to do is take my time and just straighten out the seam by stretching it, making sure all my raw edges are going to be together. Right, so I've come to a position here. So what I want to do is now sew with my overlock to make sure that that ends up in the correct place. As I said, if you make a mistake while you're overlocking, it's not a problem. All you can do is, if you want to, you can unpick it, or you can go back to your plain sewing machine and sew the stitches on the inside line and make sure it all ends up in the correct place. Right, so this is the position I want to sew here. And when you're ready, try and overlock that. Right, once you're past that center position, it's a lot easier. Reposition your work. So when you're finished, your neckband should look like this. So now we're going to come back to the skirt and sew the skirt onto the bodice part. So where I had the pins before, I've just gone ahead and run a line of tacking stitches to hold them in the correct position. You can skip that step as you want. So now it's time to sew the skirt onto the bodice of the garment, and when this is being worn, we want the right side, as you wear it, this side to be on top. So what we're going to do is match the center front position. So the center front position is this notch here on the edge of that first pleat. So we want to match the notch on the edge of the first pleat to the notch on the edge of the first pleat on the other side. So all we do is pick up this side, put it on top of this side, match those notches, and just hold them in place with a pin. If you don't want to use a pin, you could run a line of flat stitches with your sewing machine. So once you have that in the correct position, what we're going to do is just match that upper edge. Try not to stretch it too much, and when we come across here, you'll find that the edge there, that edge there, matches with the notch there, and then this edge here will match with a notch on the other side as well. Now this will come into line, it'll come clearer as you start to overlock this to the garment, but it's all designed to line up to each other. Okay. So that is what we want to be left with. Okay. So what we're going to do now is find our bodice piece, and we're going to place these right sides together, making sure the backs match and the front match. So I'm just going to put my top like this. So find the centre front, that pleat position there, and match that to the centre front notch there. And all those notches should match up. Now come to the back, and the centre back seam here you will match to the centre back seam on the top and hold those in position there. Now working your way around from the centre back, there is a notch. The first notch you come to from the centre back is the side seam, so match that to the side seam on the skirt. Come back to the centre back and go the other way. And the first notch you come to will match to the side seam on the other side. So just double check you have that all in the right position before you go any further. If you need to, just turn it right way out again and have a look, and just check that this side is over the top, and when you're ready, overlock that together. So I'm going to overlock this starting from a side seam, making sure that the seams press towards the centre back. And I need to make sure I'm not going to make any gathers in this fabric as I sew it. We want everything to be flat. Remember to take the pins out as you sew. To sew the belt loops, you can either cut 3 and do this individually, or do this all at once. So I'm just going to make one big long belt loop and then cut it into the right lengths. So take your length of fabric that's cut to the correct width, place it right sides together, and overlock the raw edges. I just find doing it this way just tidies things up. Take your loop turner and run it through the centre of your strip. Catch the top edge and turn. So now I have my loop, I'm going to go to my plain sewer and just sew a line of stitching on either side to secure this in place. So with my long loop piece, I'm just going to press it with my fingers so that that seam is right on the edge, and I'm going to sew a line of stitches just in from the edge. I'm going to come back to that top edge and I'm going to sew a line of stitching on the fold edge just in from the edge. Of course, if you had a binding attachment, you could just sew a line of binding. Okay, so now I've got my tie pieces, and you can tell because I've lengthened that stitch length, they've actually got a bit of flexibility in them. And I'm going to cut these to the correct length, which I believe is 9 centimeters, and we need 3 of them. So 9 centimeters is 3.5 inches, and sewing a tube like this just gives me a little bit of flexibility to keep these all nice and tidy and to cut off the ends or the bits that I don't like. So there's one, and I'll just use the first one to cut the second one, and I'll repeat for the third. Right, so the position of these belt loops is centre back and the side seams, and they're marked on our pattern with a drill hole. But the drill hole is basically 2.5 centimeters above and below the seam. So that's 1 inch above and 1 inch below the seam. So all we need to do now is to sew these in the correct place. Now you could drill hole those drills into position on your fabric, but really there's no need for this fabric, for this pattern. Especially if you're using a knit, a drill hole might cause a hole in your fabric, so you would be better off chalking them in place. So here is the garment side seam, and the position this needs to be is 1 inch and 1 inch, so 2.5 centimeters up and 2.5 centimeters down. Now as you can tell, this is longer than that. That's because this needs to slightly be baggy to allow our belt to pass through. So bring the side seam under your machine like this. So here's the skirt and here's the bodice area. So decide which way you want it out and work out where 2.5 centimeters is on that seam line. So what I'm going to do is, there's my inch markings there, so I'm pretty close. So I want to sew this belt loop in place here. What I'm going to do is place the belt loop under. Now there's a 6mm 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here. So place the belt loop like this, and I'm just going to place it under the presser foot. And the presser foot is 6mm or 5 to 6mm, so 1/4 of an inch. So what we're going to do is now just tack that into position on that side seam line. Just go forwards and backwards a few times until that is secured into place. So what we do now is that needs to be folded over and down, and we're going to fold that up by 6mm, 1/4 of an inch, and come and sew the other side in 2.5 centimeters down. I'm going to take my tape measure, find my position, and you may have chalked that in, that's fine. So that's where we need to sew it, and I'm going to bring that down like that and turn it under. Make sure that 6mm is on that drill mark position. I'm just going to pull that out of place like that. I'm going to come across here and stitch that in place like that. So now it's time to sew the belt. I decided to place a contrast piece in the centre back of my belt, but of course this is just patterned to be made in one fabric, just an option you can do. So take your belt piece and place it right sides together like this. starting at the fold, overlock to the end, and I'm going to overlock right off the edge. Okay, that would just give me a nice sharp turn position. And now we're going to overlock up the side. There are notches to help you match on the way because it's very easy to get these out of position. So just when you're ready, overlock. There's a notch here. We're going to match those notches. And this will just stop our belt from twisting. Now you're going to come up to another notch. Bear in mind the centre back is still a fair way on. At this next notch, I always find that it's around about the side seam position. It's a really good idea to stop here, and that can create your area for turning your belt inside out. So just overlock up to and off at that next notch position. Now you don't have to do it my way if you don't want to, but what I'm going to do now is just turn that end of the belt through. I just find it a bit easier if I do that in the beginning. If you have a loop turner, you could use that, whatever you find easier. Okay, so now come back to that position there, and we want to overlock the other end together. So place that right sides together again, overlock. Now this side you can see we're going to end up very close to our other overlocking. So just go up to but not through, and then leave a gap. So you want to leave about 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. So that just gives us an area to turn this through from. So now all we need to do is continue turning this through on the other side. So make sure you push out those points. Okay, so all we're left with now is a small turn hole. Some people just leave that open. What I like to do is just go to my flat machine and just flat stitch that closed. So here is that turn position. Sometimes you can get away, if it's really small, with just pressing it and leaving it open. What I like to do is just turn it in by the seam allowance and then just stitch the edges closed. So make sure the seam before and after is right on the edge. And then just run a row of stitches to tidy it up. And remember to take this belt to your iron and give it a really good press, making sure that that seam is pushed out right on the edge. So you want to make sure that's pushed out right like that. And do some quality control work and trim off any stray threads as you see them. So that's the end of this sew along video. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you soon for my next sew along video. Just remember, I have a Facebook pattern discussion group, so if you'd like to head on over and join that, you'll get access to hints, tips and tutorials, as well as exclusive member discounts on the latest patterns. See you soon.